Afro-American militancy. Tonight, the Garvey Movement. Since this is primarily a series of studies of individuals, it would be imagined that Marcus Garvey would be included as an individual study. But one of the purposes of this series is to present people who haven't been studied before, lives of individuals who have been omitted from history and who deserve some credit. Garvey has been treated as an individual. Most of the treatments of the Garvey movement treat him as the great charismatic individual leader. Rather, I would prefer to look at the movement as a whole, to give some credit to the others who participated, the grassroots who helped to make Garvey's movement what it was. His role will be apparent. The Garvey movement was many things to many people. The rank-and-file members saw it as something of a way of life. Unable to gain recognition in a white-dominated world, the average Garveyite created his own world. Wherever there was a sizable following, there were Liberty Halls, which served the needs of Garveyites. Mrs. Amy Jacks Garvey wrote a description of Liberty Halls, quote, "Sunday concerts and dances were held there, especially on holidays and Saturday nights. Notice boards were put up where one could look for a room, a job, or a lost article. In localities where there were many members out of work, the Black Cross nurses would organize soup kitchens and give them a warm daily meal. There were portable screens in the corner of the hall where men who could not be temporarily housed with fellow members could sleep on benches at night. In the freezing winter days, stoves had to be kept going to accommodate the cold and homeless until they got on their feet again," end quote. For the average Garveyite, the movement was much more than allegiance to its charismatic leader. The leader, Marcus Garvey, spoke of racial glory, of nationhood, of black presidents, generals, armies, navies, and of a large liberated African nation. His critics said he was all hot air and bombast. However, through Liberty Halls, through his cooperative stores and businesses, and through social meetings of local memberships, the Garvey movement created a feeling of nationhood wherever large numbers of Garveyites gathered together. In acting to achieve racial pride and glory, the Garveyites were engaging in a group psychotherapy, which counteracted group inferiority complexes. Here, Garveyism was performing a vital service for black people. Racist oppression has always relied heavily on psychological slavery to maintain dominance. In Garveyism, the humblest act was part of the larger vision of future greatness. The international conventions of Garveyites were the greatest displays of the movement, and they ran the entire month of August and were held in 1920, 21, 22, 24, 26, 29, and 1934. The 1920 convention we'll deal with in detail. This was of particular importance, for it was this convention which drew up a permanent constitution and Bill of Rights for the Negro. 2,000 official delegates were in attendance from UNI branches representing 25 countries. The convention opened on Sunday, August 1st, with 3 religious services, followed by a silent march through the streets of Harlem. Monday afternoon came the major opening, a massive parade which brought business in Harlem to a virtual standstill. A platoon of Garvey police were followed by a 50-piece band, and then the African Legionnaires with their dark blue uniforms and red striped trousers. The Legionnaires were the symbolic army of liberation for Africa. Behind the Legionnaires were the neatly marched groups of other Garvey enterprises. There were 200 Black Cross nurses attired in white and conveying both the image of medical aid and a heightened dignity for the profession of domestic service in which many of the onlookers on the Harlem streets were employed. Children marched along with their elders. Choristers sang new songs of the homeland. All in all, it was quite an occasion. That evening at Madison Square Garden, 25,000 Negroes gathered in one of the largest meetings ever held in that arena. The 1920 convention was organized in such a way that there were day sessions held at the 6,000-seat Liberty Hall in Harlem during the first week, and during these day sessions, any delegate was allowed 15 minutes to speak on conditions of Negroes in his community. These reports were designed as forming the basis for building a Negro Bill of Rights and Constitution. The evening sessions at Liberty Hall were given to addresses by prominent delegates. Now, many local chapters of Garveyites of the Universal Negro Improvement Association had been organized without direction from above and brought to the convention whatever ideas held forth in the local group. A number of branches, particularly in the West Indies, were run by socialists. There was widespread feeling among Garveyites in this convention for back to Africa, and also expressions of deep concern over discrimination and problems at home. The delegate from Atlanta told of an attempt by racists to press a version of the grandfather clause through the Georgia legislature, thus prohibiting all Negroes in that state from voting. In another vein, the delegate from Norfolk, Virginia, took his quarter hour to explain to the audience that Negroes in his state were treated better than in any other state in the South. In the intervals of the reports and after the meetings, little groups gathered to discuss the possibility of liberating Africa. It was noted that talk of war and what must be done to England was general. It was felt that Liberia would be the foothold for working to redeem the fatherland. Mayor Johnson of Monrovia, Liberia, a staunch Garveyite, told the convention of vast resources in his country and of possibilities for development there. The pitch of excitement came at the Madison Square Garden meeting. As Marcus Garvey mounted the speaker's stand, an ovation began, and it was better than 5 minutes before he could speak. He began by reading a telegram which the UNIA had just that day sent to Eamon de Valera, the leader of the Irish freedom fighters then battling for independence from England. Quote, 25,000 Negro delegates assembled in Madison Square Garden in mass meeting representing 400 million Negroes of the world send you greetings as President of the Irish Republic. Please accept the sympathy of Negroes of the world for your cause. We believe Ireland should be free even as Africa shall be free for the Negroes of the world. Keep up the fight for a free Ireland, end quote. The message was answered by another 5 minutes of applause. Garvey then launched into a call for liberation of Africa. He told the delegates to be prepared to shed blood for this ideal. We new Negroes, we men who have returned from World War I, we will dispute every inch of the way until we win. We will begin by framing a Bill of Rights for the Negro race and then a Constitution. Quote, and continuing, the Constitution of the United States means that every white American should shed his blood to defend that Constitution. The Constitution of the Negro race will mean that every Negro will shed his blood to defend his Constitution. If Europe is for the Europeans, then Africa shall be for the black people of the world. We say it, we mean it. A Negro in the audience yelled out at the top of his voice, "No more lynchings." Garvey went on, "Wherever I go, whether it be France, Germany, England, or Spain, I find that I am told that this is a white man's country and there is no room for a nigger. The other races have countries of their own, and it is time for the 400 million Negroes to claim Africa for themselves." Speaker after speaker accented the theme of liberation. The Reverend James W.H. Eason, a rising figure in the movement, followed Garvey and praised the demand for African freedom and concluded, whereas previously the black man, quote, has been a serf, a tool, a slave, a peon for all the world, and has been regarded as less than a man, that day has ceased. Henceforth he shall be standing by himself. Another minister, Reverend James Brooks, voiced a rather humble request, quote, "We're mighty grateful for all the white man has done for us, but we want to go home now. You brought us over, be manly, and let us go back," end quote. This brought a prolonged standing ovation from the packed audience. Another reference Garvey made in his talk, quote, "We are going home after a long vacation and are giving notice to the tenant to get out. If he doesn't, there is such a thing as forcible eviction." Behind the rhetoric on redemption of the fatherland is unfortunately little in the way of a well-rounded program for attaining the goal. The movement had grown so fast in a year and a half that by 1920 it had purchased 2 old ships to take people back to Africa, but they were of dubious seaworthiness. And when and if Afro-Americans did get to Africa, the question remained of European domination of the fatherland. How Africa was to be redeemed might have been spelled out at the 1920 convention, but the ideas bandied about in cloakrooms were not resolved in the official proceedings. The apparent openness in exchanging ideas was really but a cover-over for rapidly growing fissures among delegates of conservative and radical persuasions. That is, there were, among the Garveyites, delegates who would create a black copy of established white social systems using a copy of white establishment methods, and there were other delegates who were willing to try any and all methods, including perhaps those of socialism. These differences were becoming ever more apparent. It was around the time of the convention that Garvey dismissed the radical West Indian W.A. Domingo as editor of the Negro World because of, quote, socialist and allied leanings. A feud between the militant Dr. Du Bois and Garvey was already in the open. To reports that Du Bois had been among the 25,000 at the Garden, Garvey told the next night's meeting at Liberty Hall, quote, if Dr. Du Bois were a new Negro working for the freedom of his race, we would have been glad to know that he was there, end quote. But his association, quote, with an alien race did not atone for the writing of a few books favorable to the Negro. Garvey then added a double entendre reference to Du Bois's light skin complexion, quote, he must be 100% Negro. We do not care 2 pins for Dr. Du Bois. When we think of big Negroes, we do not think of him. The growing schisms within the UNIA threatened to wreck the most potentially powerful and radical movement ever seen in Black America. The broad nationalistic slogans of the UNIA had attracted the working classes of black people. The structure of the association was designed to attract the black masses rather than the more conservative middle classes. There was potential power in the spirit of economic cooperation seen in the Black Star Line, Negro Factories Corporation, and other Garvey enterprises. Ownership rested in the hands of the race as a whole. The achievements of these enterprises were to be sources of pride to all black people. Functions of local UNIA branches stimulated a fraternal cohesiveness similar to a working-class lodge. A system of death benefits for UNIA members enhanced the fraternal feelings. And, all told, had the Garvey movement decided to follow through with a militant political program, it could have drawn upon the power of a membership already divorced from the American establishment, a membership with its own social world and sense of unity and purpose. The elaborate concoction of Garveyite ranks and titles with splendorous uniforms and regalia offered a group definition of status and prestige, and there were honors and titles for even the most nominal member. While some might join the elite African Legion, others could find a place as a UNIA branch chief of police or one of the branch patrolmen. And workers in UNIA factories were thought of as fighters in the cause, as were the Black Cross nurses, who worked mainly in domestic service. The drivers of a fleet of moving vans were known as members of the Universal African Motor Corps. In a movement based on support of a large number of deeply religious followers, and with a leadership which included more than its share of ex-preachers, it was to be expected that overtones of evangelical fervor would be present in the UNIA. The spirit of Christian brotherhood had its place in the black nationalist Garveyite philosophy. Intrinsically mixed with slogans of power and pride were expressions of desire for peace between the races of man. Branch letterheads of the UNIA carried the biblical reminder, quote, he created of one blood all nations to dwell upon the face of the earth, end quote. The Garveyites distinguished themselves from the empty religiosity of established Christian denominations by forming their own church. Commented R.T. Brown, one of the editors of the Negro World, quote, Africans at home, like Africans abroad, have grown weary and tired of that false brand of Christianity which teaches humility and subjection to the white usurper and exploiter, who at the same time is demonstrating an aggressiveness and overlordship that is bewildering and disillusioning. The UNIA founded a new African Orthodox church under the leadership of a former Episcopal clergyman from Boston, George Alexander McGuire, who urged Garveyites to forget white gods. Quote, "Erase the white gods from your hearts. We must go back to the native church, to our own true God." To Garveyites, God was a Negro. Proof was provided by a variety of Old Testament references to dark-skinned, matted-hair Hebrews and intermixtures with Ethiopians. The result being, according to Bishop McGuire, that if Christ came to New York, he would have come to Harlem. He would have to come to Harlem. Quote, "because all the darker peoples live here in Harlem." One of the Garvey businesses was selling Black Madonna Christmas cards. Quite aside from the official Orthodox African Church, some considered Garveyism itself to be a new religion. Quote, "To me, Garveyism is a religion," wrote Reverend R.R. Porter in the Negro World. "As with any devout believer, a true Garveyite holds fast to that which he believes is best, Garveyism. He is true to himself, others, and his religion, through the right understanding of the UNIA motto, one God, one aim, one destiny. He too shall enjoy life and live abundantly in the kingdom of heaven on earth, and know that Africa shall once more become the land of the good, the strong, and the wise." It is significant that in the 1930s, a large percentage of Garveyites went over to the communitarian heavens of Father Divine. Well, the UNIA did not realize its potential for radicalism, but it certainly realized its potential for rallying the masses. There were anywhere from 100,000 to 6 million followers, depending on which sources one chooses to believe. The potential for radicalism was unfortunately never really borne out in actuality. The broad radical statements, such as Garvey's comment at the 1920 convention, quote, "Why should we not seek an alliance with Lenin and Trotsky?" were not tied down with any political program. Garvey did have one extremely radical idea, and indirectly it got him into his greatest support. This was the concept of a world citizenship for Afro-Americans. Its indirect application was the Back to Africa scheme, which found unexpected support among Black Americans. Critics cried that a return to Africa was an impossibility. Garveyites answered that the plan called only for a minority to actually leave America. That minority would legitimize the claims of those remaining, claims that they too were citizens of a free Africa and a worldwide Black brotherhood. In the Garvey view, a Georgia Negro harassed by white citizens or police would appeal to his ambassador or consulate. Rather than plead for justice from the dominant white society, the Negro would go over the head of his national government to an international authority. Injustice to any Negro is injustice to a citizen of a free Africa and would be treated much as mistreatment of a Frenchman in America would be treated by the French. At least so ran the theory. Details might have been worked out at UNIA conventions, but appears rhetoric dominated over concrete program planning. Concerning the problems of Garveyites in getting down to concrete issues, it should be noted that the Garvey movement was a movement of youth. Marcus Garvey was 26 years old when he founded the UNIA in Jamaica in 1914, and most of his lieutenants were of similar age. In addition, it was quite new. It was the first time anyone had really tried to put such scheme and such ideas on a large scale, so naturally it was going to run into difficulties in application.